Good evening, wherever you're listening from tonight, and welcome to the Sleepy History. I'm glad you're here. Somewhere along the Nile, the day is letting go of its heat. The light has turned from white to gold, and now to a soft amber that lies across the water like a blanket smoothed by a patient hand. The river moves slowly here, in no hurry at all, carrying the last brightness of the sun toward the far bend, where the reeds grow tall and dark. A breeze comes up off the water, cooler than the air of the afternoon, and it carries the smell of wet clay and drying mud and the faint green scent of the fields. On the low rooftops of a small village, the mudbrick still holds the warmth of the day, and here and there, as the sky deepens, a single lamp begins to glow in a window, small and steady, marking a home where someone has come in from the work of the world to rest. If this quiet journey into ancient history helps you unwind tonight, you're always welcome to subscribe and settle in with us, and to gently like the video so that others looking for calm can find their way here too. And if you feel like it, you might leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are listening from tonight. It's a lovely thing to imagine all these small lamps lit in so many different places, each of us quietly drifting toward the same slow river. Now, let the world outside fade a little. Let your shoulders soften. There is nowhere to be and nothing to solve for the next while. We are simply going to walk together into an ordinary evening thousands of years ago. When most of us picture ancient Egypt, we picture the enormous things, the pyramids standing gold against the desert, the great temples with their columns like stone forests, the painted tombs of kings and queens whose names we still say aloud today. And all of that was real, and it was grand, and it deserves its wonder. But that is not where we are going tonight. Tonight we're turning away from the horizon and its monuments, and toward something much smaller and much quieter. Toward one lamp in one window, in one modest house beside the water. Because behind every great age of history, there are countless ordinary lives that the grand story never quite paused to notice. Lives spent grinding grain and carrying water, mending cloth and closing doors against the night. And among those lives were women who lived on their own women whose days were their own to shape, in a world we usually only glimpse from a great distance. So let us go closer. Let us leave the wide river and its golden light behind us, and move toward that single doorway and ask, gently, who it was who lived there. So who was she? The woman behind that single doorway? The honest answer is that she was not one woman at all, but many. There is no single story here, no one figure we can hold up and say this was the woman who lived alone beside the Nile. There were a great many of them, across a great span of time, and the paths that led each of them to their own quiet threshold were as different as the women themselves. Some had been married and were married no longer. A husband might have died, and into the world without our medicines, death came often and without warning, taking the young as well as the old. A woman widowed in this way might keep the home they had shared and go on living in it, her days now shaped by her own hand rather than by two. Others had parted from a husband while he still lived. In some periods and in some households, a marriage could be ended, and a woman could return to a life of her own, carrying her belongings and her standing back out through the door she had once come in by. But not every woman living alone had ever married at all. Some remained unmarried by circumstance, and some, it seems, by something closer to choice. Though we should be careful here, the inner reasons of ordinary people rarely survive in the record, and we must not pretend to know more than we do. There were also women whose husbands were simply elsewhere. A man might be away for long stretches working on distant projects, travelling for trade, sent off with the labour gangs of the great building sites, leaving a wife to run the household on her own for months at a time, alone in every practical sense even while married on paper. All of this varied, of course, depending on class, on wealth, on the town or village, and on the particular century, for ancient Egypt was not one unchanging place, but a civilization that stretched across thousands of years. A woman of comfortable means living alone had a very different life from a poor one, and both would have puzzled at being grouped together at all. What matters for us tonight is gentler than any of these details. It is simply this, that living alone for a woman beside the Nile was not in itself a mark of shame, nor was it necessarily a tragedy to be pitied. It was one of the ordinary shapes a life could take. A closed door did not mean a closed heart. A single cup on a shelf, a single folded garment, a woven mat where one person slept. These were not signs of something missing, but of a life being quietly lived on its own terms, in its own rhythm. And to understand that rhythm, we have to step closer still past the threshold and into the walls that held her days. Before we step through her door, it helps to understand the land that held her home, because no life beside the Nile can really be understood apart from the river itself. Egypt was and is a thin ribbon of green drawn through a vast expanse of desert. If you could have risen up into the evening sky and looked down, you would have seen it plainly, and a narrow band of dark, living soil following the water on either side. And then, quite suddenly, the pale endless sand beginning where the last field ended. The Egyptians had names for this. The black land they called the fertile strip for the rich dark earth the river left behind. The red land they called the desert beyond. And a woman standing at the edge of her village could often see both at once, the green she lived on and the emptiness that pressed against it. That green existed only because of the river, and the river did something extraordinary and dependable every year. It rose. Once a year, swollen with rains far to the south that most Egyptians would never see, the Nile overflowed its banks and spread across the low fields, soaking the ground and laying down a fresh coat of fertile silt. Then, slowly it drew back again, leaving the earth dark and ready for planting. This was not a flood to be feared, as floods are feared elsewhere. It was awaited. It was the very thing that made life possible, and a year when the river rose too little was far more frightening than a year when it rose as it should. Out of this rising and falling came the shape of the whole year. There was the season of the flood, when the fields lay under water and much outdoor work paused. There was the season of planting and growing, when the land was worked and the crops came up green. And there was the season of the harvest and the low water, when the grain was gathered and the river ran quiet in its bed. 3 broad seasons turning one into the next as steady as breathing. For the woman in her small house, this great cycle was not an abstract thing. It set the price and plenty of grain in the market. It decided when the men of the village were busy in the fields and when they were free. It filled the air with the smell of wet silt in one season and dry dust in another. Her own small routine, the water she carried, the bread she baked, the cloth she wove sat quietly inside this enormous rhythm, like one soft note held within a long, slow piece of music. And there is something calming in that even now. Her days were tied not to the anxious clock we know, but to a cycle far larger than herself, one that had turned long before she was born and would turn long after. A vast, patient order held her small life, and inside that order stood one modest house, waiting in the last of the light. And so we come, at last, to the house itself. It stands close among its neighbours, in a cluster of homes set back a little from the water, along a narrow lane where the day's footsteps have worn the earth smooth. The walls are mudbrick, plain and thick, still faintly warm to the touch from the sun that has now slipped below the fields. There is nothing grand about it. No painted columns, no carved lintel bearing a great name. It is a small home, like 100 others in the village, and that is exactly why it is worth pausing over. History remembers the palaces easily enough. It is the ordinary door that slips away. Look at the doorway now, in the last of the light. There is a step at its base, low and slightly hollowed in the centre, where countless comings and goings have pressed it down over the years. That small hollow is its own quiet record proof of a life lived in and out of this single opening day after day, season after season. Above it the frame is simple wood, and across the opening perhaps a length of woven cloth hangs to soften the entrance and keep the dust from drifting in. And then, just inside, there is the lamp. It is a modest thing, this lamp, a shallow dish of pottery holding a little oil and a twist of wick, its flame no larger than a fingertip. But in the gathering dark it changes everything. From the lane outside, that soft glow in the doorway says something plain and human and true. Someone is home. Someone has come in from the work of the day, has set down what they were carrying, and has lit the small flame that turns a set of walls into a dwelling. The great river runs on in the dark beyond the village, vast and cool and indifferent. But here, in this one small room, the light is warm, and the night is kept gently at bay. There is a particular comfort in that contrast, the wide darkness outside and the small bright room within. It is a comfort you may know yourself, listening now, perhaps with your own low light beside you, to be enclosed, to be sheltered, to have a threshold between yourself and the wider world, and to have crossed to the safe side of it for the night. We have stood in the valley and watched the river. We have wondered about the woman and the many roads that might have led her here. Now the doorway is before us, and the lamp is lit, and the evening invites us in. So let us step across that worn stone threshold gently, the way a welcome guest would. Let us go inside into the cool and the quiet and see the rooms that held her days and the small comforts she made her own. Step inside, and the first thing to meet you is not a sight but a feeling. The air changes. Out in the lane the heat still lingers even after sundown, but here, within these walls, the air is cooler, stiller, gently shadowed. It is the kind of coolness that seems to rise up out of the very earth, and in a land as bright and demanding as Egypt, that shade was one of the small mercies of an ordinary home. The walls that hold it are made of mud brick, and it is worth pausing over how humble and how clever that material really was. The Egyptians made their bricks from the very stuff the river gave them mud from the banks, mixed with sand and chopped straw, pressed into simple wooden moulds and left out in the sun to dry hard. No great kiln was needed, no rare or costly thing. The land itself supplied the walls. A house, in a real sense, was made of the same silt that made the fields, shaped by patient hands and dried by the same sun that warmed everything else. And these thick, earthen walls did something quietly wonderful. Through the blazing hours of the day they held the heat out, keeping the inside cool and dim. Then, through the cold of the desert night, they slowly gave that stored warmth back, so that the room never turned as bitter as the open air. It was a kind of shelter that breathed with the day, softening the sharp edges of a harsh climate. The bright, punishing world was kept on the far side of the mud, and within there was shade and steadiness. The light inside was gentle for another reason too. Windows where they existed were small and set high in the walls, little more than slots to let the air move and a soft glow filter through. This kept out the fierce sun and the blowing dust, but it also meant that the interior lived in a permanent tender dimness, lit more by the doorway and the lamp than by any broad window. Underfoot the floor was most often packed earth, swept smooth and hard by years of bare feet and the daily pass of a broom plane, but clean and cool against the soles. None of this was luxury. A mud brick home needed care, the bricks could crumble, the walls needed patching, the flat roof had to be maintained. Homes stood close together along shared lanes, wall against wall, and a life here was never far from a neighbour's. But for all its plainness, it was true, shelter, cool in the heat, warm in the cold, quiet against the noise of the world. And within these sheltering walls, the space was not one open room, but several, each shaped to its own gentle purpose. Let us see how the house was arranged and how she moved through it. A modest Egyptian home was rarely a single bare space. More often it was a small sequence of rooms, each with its own quiet role, flowing one into the next the way the hours of a day flow into one another. Near the entrance there was usually a front room, the first space a visitor would step into and the most public part of the house. Here the day's work often happened a place to sit and spin, to receive a neighbour, to keep the things most used. It caught what light came through the doorway, and it was, in a sense, the face the house showed to the lane outside. Beyond it, set deeper in and more sheltered, lay the more private spaces, a room for sleeping, quieter and dimmer, tucked away from the comings and goings of the front. And somewhere, tucked into a corner or a smaller adjoining space, there was room for storage. The jars of grain, the water, the folded cloth, the small hoard of things a household needed to carry it through the seasons. The rooms were furnished simply. A few low stools rather than tall chairs, storage jars standing against a wall, their contents sealed against dust and insects, a woven mat that could be a seat by day and part of a sleeping place by night, perhaps a low chest or a niche in the wall for keeping smaller treasures. Nothing crowded, nothing excessive, an economy of things that we, surrounded by so much, might find almost restful to picture. And then, very often, there was the roof. The flat rooftop of an Egyptian house was not wasted space, but a genuine room of its own, open to the sky. On hot nights when the interior held too much of the day's warmth, the roof offered cool air and the whole vault of stars overhead. Household tasks could be done there in the open. Grain could be dried, things could be stored, and on the warmest evenings a person might carry up a mat and sleep beneath the night itself, the village hushed below and the great dark river somewhere off in the distance. For a woman living alone, there was something quietly meaningful in all this. Within these rooms, she may have enjoyed a measure of control over her own space. She could decide where to sit and work in the morning light, where to keep her few precious things, and whether to sleep in the sheltered room or on a warm night beneath the stars. The space was small, and her means may have been modest, and the world beyond her walls placed real limits on a woman's life. But within these walls, the ordering of the day was hers. She shaped her rooms to her own rhythm and moved through them at her own pace. And that small freedom, the freedom to arrange one's own quiet space, is not a small thing at all. And the rooms she shaped were filled with objects, each one holding a little of her days. Let us look now at those. A small object could tell you more about a life than any grand inscription ever could. The great monuments of Egypt speak of kings and gods, of victories and eternity. But the true texture of a person's days is held in humbler things, the bowl she ate from, the comb she drew through her hair, the stone she knelt beside each morning. These are the things that ordinary hands touched again and again, and in their very wear and plainness they hold a kind of tenderness the monuments do not. Picture, then, some of what filled her rooms. Against a wall, the grinding stone, the saddle quern, a lower slab and an upper handstone, worn smooth and slightly hollowed by the daily work of turning grain into flour. It was heavy, unglamorous, and utterly essential, and its curved hollow was shaped by her own labour, day after day, until the stone itself carried the record of her bread. Nearby, the storage jars, their mouths sealed, holding grain and water and whatever small surplus the seasons allowed, and the vessels of daily use, a favoured bowl, perhaps plain pottery, but hers, the one her hand reached for without thinking. Among these practical things there were smaller, more personal ones. A mirror, if she had one, not glass as we know it, but a disc of polished bronze or copper, held by a handle showing a soft golden reflection of her face. A comb of wood, its teeth cut fine for ordering the hair. A few beads, perhaps, or a simple pot that once held a scented oil, for the Egyptians of many stations cared about cleanliness and grace, about oiled skin against the dry air and a little sweetness against the heat. And there would be linen folded cloth, the everyday fabric of Egyptian life, some of it perhaps woven by her own hands. None of this was wealth. A woman of modest means owned few things, and each thing had to earn its place by being useful, or beloved, or both. But that is exactly what makes these objects speak so clearly. When a person owns little, what they keep becomes a kind of map of who they are, the tools of her survival, the small comforts she allowed herself. Perhaps one thing kept for no practical reason at all, a bead, a little figure, an object handed down, carrying a memory, a person, a moment now lost to us but precious to her. We should be careful, of course. We cannot know the particular story of any one bowl or comb, and much of what such women owned has simply crumbled back into the earth. What survives is partial, and often skewed toward the better off. Yet even the fragments remind us that a life was lived here, carefully, attentively, one small object at a time. And of all the places in her home, one held her most gently of all the place where, at the end of each day, she lay down to sleep. At the end of every day, however it had been spent, there was the same quiet return to the place where she lay down to rest. Her bed was a simple thing. In many modest homes it was little more than a woven mat unrolled upon the floor, or perhaps a low wooden frame strung with cords, laid over with linen and softened by whatever coverings she owned. There were no great piles of cushions, no heavy hangings, but there did not need to be. In the deep cool of the night, drawn up beneath a woven cover, a person could be perfectly sufficiently warm, held by the same thick walls that had kept the day's heat at bay. At the head of the bed, if she had one, there rested a headrest, one of the gentler curiosities of Egyptian life. It was a curved support of wood, raised on a small stand made to cradle the neck rather than the whole head, keeping it lifted a little above the ground. To us it might look hard, but softened with a folded cloth that did its quiet work, keeping the head cool in the warm night, lifting it away from the dust and the crawling things of the floor. Whole generations laid their heads upon such rests and slept, and there is something touching in the thought of it, this small carved object whose only purpose was to help a tired person rest. The last light of the day was the lamp. Its little flame, no bigger than a fingertip, threw a soft and shifting glow across the mudbrick walls, and then, as the oil burned low, it dimmed and shrank, and finally went out, leaving the room to the dark. And in that dark there was the sound of the village settling, a voice somewhere growing quiet, and beyond it all, faint and steady, the murmur of the great river moving on through the night. Here we come to something worth sitting with, gently. She was alone in this house, and the night was long and dark, and the world beyond the walls could be uncertain. And yet she was not without safety. Her door was shut. Her neighbours slept close on every side, wall against wall along the lane, near enough to hear, near enough to help. The thick earthen walls held the warmth and kept out the cold. To be alone was not, here, to be unprotected. Solitude and safety could lie down together in the same small room. So picture her now, settled beneath her cover, her head resting easy, the lamp gone dark, the day's work all behind her, and nothing left to do but breathe and let go. The river runs on, the stars turn slowly overhead, and in one small house among many, a tired person sinks softly into sleep. And when that sleep gives way, as it always does, to the first pale light of morning, the day will begin again by the water. Before the heat came, the day began. In the cool grey light, before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, she would rise. There was no hurry to it, no sharp summons, only the gentle habit of a body that woke with the light. The village was still soft and quiet at this hour, the air fresh in a way it would not be again until evening, and the first task of the day was one of the oldest and simplest there is, to fetch water. She would take up her jar, a rounded vessel of pottery, wide-bellied and made to be carried, and step out through the doorway into the pale morning. The lane would be stirring, but gently, a few other figures moving in the same direction, toward the same slow river that had made everything possible. There was a rhythm to this shared errand, a quiet companionship in it. The water's edge in the early morning was a meeting place as much as a working place, where paths crossed and a word was exchanged, where the news and small kindnesses of village life passed from one person to the next before the day's labours pulled everyone apart. At the river bank the world was cool and alive. The water lay smooth and silver, catching the first light. Reeds stood dark against the brightening sky, and birds called across the shallows, the constant soft companions of the Nile, wading and lifting and settling again. She would fill the jar, feeling it grow heavy in her hands, the cold river water and the wet clay both against her skin. Then, with practiced care, she would lift it and turn for home, the weight balanced on shoulder or hip, her steps measured and even along the familiar path. It was hard work in its plain way. Water is heavy and it must be carried every single day, for there was no keeping a great store of it fresh. But there was also something steadying in it, something that gave the morning its shape. This was the first thread of the day, and it connected her to everything at once, to the river that fed the land, to the neighbours who walked the same path, to the countless mornings before this one, and the countless mornings still to come. For a woman living alone, this daily errand carried a small double meaning. Out at the water's edge she was among others, greeted and known, a face in the shared life of the village. And then she turned back, alone, toward her own quiet doorway, where no one waited but no one was needed. The public bank and the private home, joined by a short walk with a heavy jar, the social morning and the solitary house, both part of one ordinary day. Back inside she would set the water down in its cool corner, and with the day's water gathered, the next task was already waiting, the making of the morning bread. If water was the first thread of the morning, bread was the second, and in many ways it was the very centre of Egyptian life. Bread was not merely one food among many, it was the food, the daily foundation of nearly every table in the land. Alongside beer, which was thick and mild and nourishing, bread was what filled the stomach and carried a person through the hours of work. So common was it, so essential, that grain itself served almost as a measure of wealth, and a household's security could be read in the jars of grain it kept against the coming seasons. To make bread was not a small chore. It was the daily act on which everything else rested. And it began with the grinding stone. She would kneel beside it in the cool of the morning, take a handful of grain, and set to work with the heavy upper stone, pushing it back and forth, crushing the kernels into flour. It was slow, patient physical labour. The stone was heavy in the hand, and the motion asked something of the whole body, and it had to be repeated day after day, for flour, like water, did not keep well and was best made fresh. A fine dust of ground grain rose faintly in the air and settled on her hands and arms as she worked. When enough flour was gathered, she would mix it with water, working it into a dough, kneading it with the heels of her hands until it came together, smooth and yielding. Perhaps she shaped it into flat rounds, or pressed it into moulds, and then it went to baking in the warm ash of the hearth, or against the heated wall of a simple clay oven until the surface firmed and browned. And then, at last, came the smell. There are few scents more universally comforting than baking bread, and it filled the small room with a warmth that was more than heat. The plain, deep satisfaction of food made ready by one's own hands. There is something quietly moving in this labour when we remember she did it alone. In a larger household, such work might be shared among several women, hands and voices together at the stone. On her own, the whole of it fell to her, the grinding, the kneading, the baking, the keeping of the grain. It was undeniably hard, this daily round of heavy, repetitive work, and yet it was also, in its way, a small daily proof of her own sufficiency. She could feed herself. She could take grain from the jar and turn it, by her own effort, into the bread that would carry her through the day. Hard labour and warm bread, the aching arm and the finished loaf, the two lived side by side in a single morning, and once the bread was made and the household fed, her hands could turn to work of a different kind, the slow, steadying craft of thread and cloth. With the bread made and the morning's most pressing needs met, her hands could turn to slower work, the making of cloth. Of all the labours that filled a woman's day in ancient Egypt, the working of thread and linen was among the most common and the most enduring. Linen was the fabric of Egyptian life, spun and woven from the flax that grew in the fields, and it clothed nearly everyone, from the plainest villager to the priest in the temple. Behind all of that cloth stood the patient work of spinning and weaving, and much of that work was done by women, in the front rooms and doorways and courtyards of ordinary homes. Spinning came first. She would take the prepared fibres of flax and, with a spindle a slender shaft weighted with a small round whirl, draw them out and twist them into thread, letting the spindle turn and dangle and wind the growing length upon itself. It was a task that hands learned so deeply they could do it almost without looking, a rhythm of pull and twist and wind repeated through the long, quiet hours. Then came the loom, where the threads were set and crossed and beaten together, row upon row, until slowly, patiently, a length of cloth took shape beneath her hands. There is a particular calm to this kind of work, the calm of a repeated motion that occupies the hands and frees the mind. Time softens in it. The morning's heavier labours gave way to something steadier and quieter. The small sounds of the spindle turning, the loom's gentle beat, the slow accumulation of thread into cloth. For a woman working alone, these long hours of craft were not empty. They had purpose in them, and a certain peace. And they had value in another sense too. Cloth was not only for the household's own use. Good linen was a thing worth having, a thing that could be traded or sold, and a woman skilled at the loom held a real and useful ability. What she made with her own hands could clothe her, yes, but it could also become the means to obtain other things she needed, exchanged in the give and take of village life. The plain domestic chore and the marketable skill were in truth the same act. The cloth that warmed her could also, if she chose, help sustain her. We should not paint this too neatly. Not every woman spun fine linen, and skill and equipment and time all varied with a person's circumstances. But across the ordinary homes of Egypt, this quiet work went on, hour after hour, hands moving in their patient rhythm, and when the heat of the day grew heavy, even that gentle labour would pause. For in the fierce hours around midday, the wise thing was to set the work aside, seek the shade, and let the body rest. By the middle of the day, the sun stood high and fierce, and the land seemed to hold its breath. This was often an hour when labour slowed. In a climate as bright and demanding as Egypt's, the heat of midday pressed down on everything, and the sensible rhythm of life bent around it. Work slowed. The lanes grew quiet. People sought the shade, the cool interior of a mudbrick room, the shadow of a wall, any refuge from the weight of the sun. And so, in the very centre of her busy day, there came a pause, a natural hollow of stillness carved out by the heat itself. She would set aside the spindle or the cloth and settle somewhere cool, perhaps just inside the doorway, where the shadowed room met the bright lane, or in the dim quiet of an inner room. And here, in this pause, there was room for the small pleasures that made a hard life not only bearable, but, in its quiet way, good. There might be fruit the sweetness of dates, sticky and rich, or soft figs, or whatever the season had given. There would be water, or the mild household beer to ease the dryness of the throat. Simple things, but in the heat of the day they were their own kind of luxury. Sweetness on the tongue, coolness in the mouth, the plain relief of rest after the morning's work. The Egyptians knew the pleasure of such things, and a person did not need to be wealthy to taste a ripe date in the shade and feel, for a moment, entirely content. And here, gently as where a woman living alone held a small and genuine freedom. In a crowded household, a woman's time was often shaped by the needs of others, a husband to feed, children to tend, the endless small demands of a family pulling at her hours. But she answered to none of that. When the heat came, she may sometimes have had more freedom to shape this pause around her own needs. No husband or children within the house were calling for her attention, though work, obligation and necessity still set limits of their own. Even so, some portion of that midday stillness may have belonged to her alone. We should not pretend her life was easy. It was not, and the labours of the morning would return in the cooler hours to come. But it is worth noticing, and worth honouring, that even within a life of real work there were these pockets of ease, the shade, the sweetness, the unhurried breath. Constant duty on the one hand and a stolen hour of peace on the other, and both of them true. When the worst of the heat had passed and the light began, at last, to lengthen and soften, she would rouse herself again. There were things to gather, and goods to carry, and a short walk to make out from the quiet house and into the lively lanes of the market. In the softer light of the later afternoon, when the fierce heat had eased, the village came alive again, and nowhere more than in the market. There is an old idea, still lingering in some corners of imagination, that the women of the ancient world were kept quietly indoors, hidden away from the public life of buying and selling and speaking. And for some times and places, there is truth in versions of that picture. But beside the Nile, the marketplace tells a different and warmer story. Here, women were a familiar and ordinary presence, moving through the crowd, offering goods, striking bargains, part of the everyday hum of trade. A woman among the market stalls was not out of place. She belonged there as much as anyone, so picture her stepping into it now. The market was not a grand building, but an open, informal gathering, goods laid out on mats and in baskets along the lanes, or spread in a cleared space where the paths of the village met. The air was full of voices, the easy noise of people greeting and haggling and calling out what they had to offer. There were baskets of grain and fish fresh from the river, and vegetables and fruit heaped in fragrant piles. There was pottery and rope and folded cloth. Dust rose gently underfoot, and here and there a length of matting or an awning threw a patch of shade across the goods below. She would carry with her whatever she had to trade, perhaps a portion of the linen she had woven, or bread she had baked beyond her own needs, or some small surplus of her household. And as she moved among the stalls she was greeted, and she greeted others in turn. This was not a place of strangers. It was a gathering of neighbours and near neighbours, of faces known across many seasons, and to walk through it was to be woven again into the shared life of the community. A woman living alone at home was here in the market, entirely among others, seen, spoken to, part of the crowd. There was a real pleasure in that belonging. After the quiet of the house and the solitary work of the loom, the market offered warmth of a different kind. The liveliness of many people together, the small dramas of a good bargain, the passing news carried from mouth to mouth. It was work. Yes, she came to trade. Not to idle, but it was work with company in it, and company is its own nourishment. And in this lively place, an interesting question arises, one that shaped every exchange she made. For when she handed over her cloth or her bread, and took something in return, no coins passed between them at all. So how then was value measured and a fair trade struck? To understand that, we must look a little closer at how this coinless world actually worked. Here is something that surprises many people when they first learn it. For most of ancient Egypt's long history, there was no coinage in everyday use. No coins changed hands in the market. No little discs of stamped metal passed from buyer to seller. Coinage, as we would recognize it, came late to Egypt, arriving only in the final chapters of its ancient story. For the great span of centuries before coinage became established, much of the busy life of trade, grain and fish and cloth and pottery, moving from hand to hand, was carried on without coins. And yet trade flourished. So how did it work? The answer was a system of value measured against goods themselves and against agreed standards of weight. Everything had a worth that could be expressed in relation to a common measure. Grain was one such measure, plentiful, essential, and understood by all. And there were standard units of value based on weights of metal, such as the copper or silver measure the Egyptians used to reckon worth. A thing was not sold for coins, but priced at so much of grain or valued at so many units of copper's weight, and then paid for in whatever goods came to the same amount. Imagine, then, what an ordinary exchange really asked of her. She wished to trade her woven cloth for, say, a portion of fish and a jar of oil. Each of those things had its recognized value, and so did her cloth. To make a fair trade, she had to hold all of it in her mind at once to know roughly what her linen was worth, to weigh it against what she wanted, to balance the exchange until both sides came out even. This was mental arithmetic, done quickly and quietly amid the noise of the market, without a single written figure before her. There is a quiet cleverness in that which is easy to overlook. We tend to think of great economic history in grand terms, the wealth of temples, the storehouses of kings, the vast accounts of the state. But the economy also lived here, in the head of one woman weighing cloth against fish in an afternoon market. Her numeracy was practical and unshowy, learned by doing, exercised every time she traded. It never entered any monument or royal record. Yet it was real skill, and she used it as naturally as she used her hands at the loom. We should be careful not to overstate the neatness of it. Prices shifted, bargaining was part of the dance, and disputes over fair value surely happened as they always do. But the underlying truth stands. She moved through a coinless world with confidence, reckoning worth in her mind and holding her own in the exchange. And this raises a gentler question still. We have seen how she traded, but what in the first place did she have to trade? How did a woman living alone actually earn her keep? That is where we turn next. So what did she have to bring to that market? How did a woman on her own actually sustain herself day by day and season by season? The answer is that there were more paths than we might expect, though we should walk among them carefully, remembering that a woman's options depended greatly on her class, her skills, her age, her place, and the particular period she lived in. Not every door was open to every woman. But across the ordinary life of Egypt, women found real ways to support themselves, and it is worth naming a few of them gently. The most familiar we have already seen, the making of things at home. A woman skilled at the loom could sell or trade her linen, one who baked more bread than she needed, or brewed the mild household beer could offer the surplus in exchange for other goods. These home crafts turned quietly into livelihood, the daily work of the household spilling over into the wider economy of the village. Beyond that, there was work done for others. Some women served in wealthier households, taking wages in grain and goods for their labour. Some worked in the fields at harvest when many hands were needed. And there were more particular callings too. Some women worked as midwives, attending births, carrying knowledge passed from woman to woman across the generations. Some served as professional mourners, lending their voices to funerals, for grief in Egypt had its formal expressions and its place in ritual. And some were musicians and dancers, especially in service of the temples and their festivals, their skill a genuine trade that could be practiced and valued. We must not romanticize this. Much of it was hard and modest and uncertain, and a woman alone without wealth or family behind her lived closer to hardship than we might like to picture. The records that survive tell us more about some kinds of women than others, and the lives of the poorest often left the faintest trace of all. When we speak of how she earned, we are gathering possibilities, not describing a single guaranteed path. And yet, held all together, these possibilities carry a real and quiet dignity. The wider structures of her world set limits on women in many matters they did not stand equal to men, and no one should pretend otherwise. But within those limits, a great many women found genuine ways to sustain themselves and their small households, through their own skill and effort. Limitation on the one hand and real working agency on the other, side by side in the same life. She could then earn. She could make and sell, serve and be paid, practice a craft or a calling and receive its reward. But that raises one more question, and perhaps the most surprising of all. When she earned something or made something or was given something, could she truly keep it? Could a woman in this ancient world hold property as her own? To that quietly remarkable matter we turn now. We come now to something that has quietly surprised many who study the ancient world, and it is worth approaching with both wonder and care. For all the limits that Egyptian society placed upon women, in one striking respect they held a standing that was unusual for their time. A woman could own property in her own name. She could hold goods and land and even a house. She could receive an inheritance and keep it as her own. She could earn, and what she earned was hers, and crucially, marriage did not dissolve this. A woman who married did not simply fold her belongings into her husband's. In many arrangements she kept what was hers, distinct and recognized, and could carry it away again if the marriage ended. Think, then, of what this meant for the woman living alone. The very house we've been sitting inside of, its mudbrick walls, its cool rooms, its worn threshold could belong to her. Not held for her by a father or a brother, not hers only by permission, but hers in the way a thing is truly owned, recorded, and acknowledged. The doorway she closed each night she could close upon her own property. In a world where in so many other places a woman's belongings passed always through the hands of some man, this quiet fact stands out like a lamp in a dark window. And this ownership left real traces. Property could be recorded, set down by a scribe on papyrus, witnessed, kept. Goods could be marked, jars sealed, a household's holdings noted and remembered. When such a woman decided what would become of her belongings, her wishes carried weight. The things she had gathered through a lifetime of work were hers to keep, to use, and to pass on as she saw fit. We should temper our wonder with honesty as always. The details of these rites varied across the long centuries of Egyptian history and across the different levels of society, and the fullest evidence often comes from those with something worth recording, which is to say, not the very poorest. A woman with little owned little and legal standing did not fill an empty grain jar. This was not a world of equality. It was a world with one quietly remarkable feature within a larger frame of limits. But the feature is real, and it deserves to be sat with gently. A woman beside the Nile, living alone, could stand as the true owner of her own doorway. That is not a small thing. It is the difference between a life merely permitted and a life genuinely held in one's own hands. And to own, of course, is to have something the law must recognize and protect. So we move now from the things she could keep to the larger question standing behind them, where a woman actually stood before the law of her land. To own a house is one thing. To be able to stand before the law as a person in your own right, to speak, to sign, to be heard, is something deeper, and it is here that we find another of the quiet surprises of Egyptian life. In many ancient societies, a woman had no independent standing before the law. She acted through a man, a father, a husband, a guardian, who spoke and signed and appeared on her behalf, as though she herself were not quite a full person in the eyes of the courts. But the picture that survives from Egypt suggests something different. A woman there could, it seems, act as a legal person in her own name. She could enter into agreements, she could buy and sell and lend, she could bring a matter before those who judged disputes, and she could give testimony. She did not need a man to stand in her place. Picture what that meant in practice. When she made a significant transaction, the sale of property, a loan, an arrangement about goods, it could be set down by a scribe, that patient figure with his reed pen and his cake of ink, forming the careful signs on a sheet of papyrus. Witnesses might be named. The document might be sealed and kept, and her name, her own name, could stand upon it as a party to the agreement, as binding as any man's. If a dispute arose, she could speak to it herself, present her side, defend what was hers. For a woman living alone, this standing was not a distant abstraction. It was the very ground beneath her daily independence. Because she could act in her own name, she could truly manage her own affairs, hold her house, protect her goods, settle what was owed to her and what she owed. The quiet self-sufficiency we have been watching all along, the woman who fetched her own water and baked her own bread and owned her own doorway, rested on this deeper foundation, that the law recognized her as someone able to act. Now, we must be careful and honest here, as we've tried to be throughout. Our evidence is incomplete, and it leans heavily toward those whose dealings were worth writing down. The lives of the poorest left far fewer records, and much of what we know reflects those with property and standing rather than everyone. Nor was this a world of equality between women and men. In a great many matters it plainly was not. What we can say is gentler and more limited, but still remarkable, that beneath her ordinary days ran a real legal footing, unusual for its age, that gave a woman alone genuine standing in the world. That footing shaped more than property. It shaped the great turning points of a life, of how marriages were made and unmade, and how the things of one generation passed to the next. To those turning points we now turn. That legal footing showed itself most clearly at the great turning points of a life, in how a marriage was made, in how it might be ended, and in how the belongings of one generation passed into the hands of the next. And it is often at these turning points that a woman found herself, in the end, living alone. Marriage in Egypt seems to have been, at its heart, a practical joining of two people into a household, rather than a grand ceremony overseen by the state. Often what marked it was the beginning of a shared life together, sometimes accompanied by an agreement about property, what each brought, what would happen to it, how things would be settled should the union one day end. These arrangements mattered because they protected what a woman owned even within the marriage, keeping her belongings recognizably her own, and a marriage could end. This is one of the details that sets Egypt apart from many of its neighbours. It appears that a woman, and not only a man, could bring a marriage to a close. Divorce was possible, and when it came, a woman did not necessarily leave empty-handed. What was hers went with her, her property, her share, the belongings she had brought or gathered. She could return to a life of her own, materially intact, and take up again the running of her own household. Here, then, is one of the gentle roads that led a woman to her solitary doorway. Not tragedy, not disgrace, but the simple, lawful ending of one chapter and the opening of another. Inheritance was another such road. When a parent or a husband died, property passed on, and women could inherit and could pass on inheritance in turn. A widow might keep the home she had shared, a daughter might receive her portion, and so a woman might come into a household of her own through the quiet workings of inheritance, holding what had been handed down to her and living within it on her own terms. We should hold all of this loosely, as we have tried to throughout, for the details shifted across the long centuries and across the different levels of society, and much of our clearest evidence comes from those with property worth recording. Not every marriage was equal, not every parting was gentle, and the human realities behind these arrangements were surely as tangled as human realities always are. But the shape of the thing is clear enough, and it is a kindly one. The paths that brought a woman to live alone, the ending of a marriage, the passing of a loved one, the receiving of an inheritance were, many of them, ordinary and lawful and survivable. A woman could come to her own doorway with her standing and her belongings intact and begin again. Yet the law was only ever part of the story. Around her stood her neighbours, her village, the small everyday world of shared lanes and shared memory, and it was often there, among people, that a life was truly settled or unsettled. The law, with its papyrus and its seals, drew the outer edges of a life. But the daily texture of justice was woven much closer to home, among neighbours, in the shared lanes, in the small frictions and settlements of village life. For most people, most of the time, the trouble that arose was not grand. It was ordinary and human and small. A borrowed tool not returned, a debt in grain not paid when it was promised, a disagreement over a boundary, over the sharing of water, over whose animal had strayed where it should not. These were the disputes that filled real life, and they rarely needed the full weight of any great authority to settle them. They were handled closer to the ground, talked through, argued over, brought before local officials or respected figures who knew the parties and the circumstances, and resolved in the ordinary way that communities have always resolved such things. For a woman living alone, this everyday justice was something she navigated for herself. She could raise a matter if she was wronged, and speak to it in her own voice and expect to be heard. If someone owed her, she could press her claim. If she was accused, she could answer. She did not have a husband to argue her case, and she did not, it seems, strictly need one. She stood among her neighbours as a party to the ordinary give and take of village fairness, defending her own interests with whatever calm and firmness she could bring to it. And here something important comes into view. In a small, close community, written law was not the only thing that mattered. Often, it was not even the main thing. What mattered just as much was memory. Everyone knew everyone. People remembered who had dealt honestly and who had not, who kept their word and who let it slip, who had helped a neighbour and who had turned away. This shared memory was itself a kind of justice, quieter than any court but powerful. A woman standing in such disputes rested partly on the law, yes, but also on the long record the village held of how she had lived and how she had treated others. We cannot know the particulars of any one woman's quarrels, and we should not pretend village life was always fair or kind. Small communities can be generous, but they can also be harsh, and the powerful have always had their advantages. What we can say is that the ordinary settling of ordinary disputes was a world she was part of, not shut out from a world where her voice counted and her conduct was remembered. And that brings us to something more delicate still. For if memory and reputation shaped how a woman fared among her neighbours, then reputation itself becomes worth pausing over that quiet thing that could either shelter a woman living alone or leave her exposed. Of all the things that surrounded a woman living alone, her walls, her belongings, her legal standing, perhaps none was quite so delicate or quite so powerful as her reputation. Reputation is a strange and double thing. In a small community where everyone was known and remembered, a good name was not merely a pleasant thing to have, it was a form of security. A woman regarded as honest, reliable, and decent found doors open to her that might otherwise have stayed shut. Neighbours were readier to lend to her, to trust her word in a dispute, to help her when help was needed, to speak for her when it mattered. Her good name went ahead of her through the lanes and stood beside her when she was not there to speak for herself. For a woman without a husband to lend her his standing, this earned reputation could become a kind of shelter all its own. But the same closeness that made a good name valuable made it fragile too. In a village, little went unseen and less went unsaid. Talk moved from doorway to doorway, and a woman living alone outside the usual pattern of the married household could find herself the subject of that talk more easily than others. Gossip could gather around her, fairly or not, and gossip had teeth. A reputation carefully built over years could be worried at by whispers, and there was no simple defence against a story once it began to move. And so she guarded her name, as anyone in her place would, through the plain daily language of conduct, in how she carried herself, in the care she took in her dealings, giving no one just cause to speak ill, in small courtesies, a greeting offered, a kindness returned, a gift shared at the right moment, a debt paid promptly, in the quiet dignity of a life lived openly and decently, so that the village's long memory of her was one of steadiness and worth. None of this was performance, exactly. It was simply the way a careful person tended the one intangible thing that could protect them. We should be gentle here, and not turn this into a burden heavier than it was. Most days, for most women, life simply went on without scandal or strain, and a good name was maintained not through anxiety but through the ordinary honesty of ordinary living. The point is not that she lived in fear of her neighbours' tongues, it is that her dignity and her security were in the end bound together, that by living well she protected herself. Social pressure on one side, then, and personal dignity on the other, and a woman quietly holding the two in balance. Yet reputation, for all its power, concerned only how she stood among the living. There was another presence in her life, closer even than her neighbours and more constant than any court, the quiet company of the gods. When we think of religion in ancient Egypt, our minds go first to the vast temples, the towering columns, the great stone halls, the sacred inner rooms where only priests could go, and that world was real and awesome and central to the life of the land. But faith did not live only in those enormous places. It lived too in the corner of a small room, in the quiet devotion of an ordinary person at the end of an ordinary day. And it is there, in the humble household shrine, that we find the gods who mattered most in the daily life of a woman alone. Somewhere in her home there was likely a place, set aside a niche in the wall, a shelf, a small corner kept for the sacred, and in it might stand a modest figure of one of the gods who watched over the home and its people. These were not the grand state deities of the great temples, distant and vast, but the close protective spirits of everyday life. There was Bess, the small, cheerful, slightly comical god who guarded the household, who watched over sleep and childbirth and drove away the dangers of the night. There was Tauret, the protective goddess who cared for women and for those bringing new life into the world. These were gods you could feel near you, homely, kindly, standing guard over the small and the vulnerable. Before such a figure she might make her offerings. Nothing grand was required. A little bread, a cup of beer, a flower laid down, a pinch of incense, its thread of fragrant smoke rising in the still air. Perhaps the lighting of the lamp itself carried something of devotion in it. These were small acts, done quietly, woven into the rhythm of the day, but they were the true religion of ordinary people, as real and as heartfelt as any ceremony in any temple. And here we find one of the gentlest truths about faith in a solitary life. A woman living alone came home each evening to a house with no other voice in it. But she did not come home to a house that was empty. In the corner stood her small protector, near and attentive, and the daily gesture of an offering was also, in its way, a small daily companionship, a moment of connection with something that cared for her and watched over her sleep. The gods of the household were company of a kind that solitude could not take away. We cannot see into her heart, of course, or know exactly what she felt as she laid a flower before a little clay figure. But we can see the practice, common across countless homes, and we can sense the comfort in it. That comfort was the intimate indoor face of her faith. But faith had a larger face too, one that drew her out of the quiet house and into the shared life of the whole community, the great festivals, and the temples that rose beside the river. The little shrine in the corner was faith made small and near, but there were days when faith grew large, when it spilled out of the quiet houses and filled the lanes and the riverbanks with colour and sound, and drew the whole community together. These were the festival days, and for a woman living alone they were among the brightest threads in the fabric of the year. Egyptian life was marked by festivals, woven into the turning of the seasons and the calendar of the gods. On such days the ordinary rhythm of work fell away. The great temples, usually closed and remote, became the centre of a shared celebration that ordinary people could take part in, each in their own way. The most striking of these were the processions. On certain days the image of a god, normally hidden deep within the temple's sacred rooms, was brought out carried in a shrine upon a sacred boat, borne on the shoulders of priests, moving in slow and solemn splendour through the crowds who had gathered to see it pass. Imagine what such a day meant. The lanes filled with people, banners and finery, the sound of music, the rattle of the sistrum, the beat of drums, voices lifted in song, the heavy sweetness of incense drifting on the air, food shared, and beer, and a loosening of the ordinary cares of ordinary days. The temple stone glowing warm in the light. It was spectacle and worship together, a moment when the divine came near enough to see, and when the whole community stood side by side to greet it. For a woman who spent most of her days in the quiet round of her own small household, these festivals offered something her ordinary life could not. They pulled her out of her solitude and set her among the crowd, one face among many, part of something vast and shared. She did not celebrate alone. She stood with her neighbours, swept up in the same music, the same wonder, the same holiday release. Whatever the quiet of her home, on these days she belonged to a great gathering, and belonging is a deep human need that a festival meets in full. We should not imagine that every woman took part in every rite, or that the deepest sacred acts were open to all. Much of the temple's inner life remained the province of priests, and access varied with time, place, and standing. What ordinary people shared was the outer celebration, the public joy of it, and that was real and abundant. And then the festival would end. The god returned to the temple's dark heart. The crowds thinned, the music faded, and each person turned back toward home, she among them, walking the familiar lane to her own doorway and her own small, steady flame. There is one more presence in her spiritual world we have not yet spoken of, closer than the festival crowd and dearer than any god, the presence of those she had loved and lost, who in the Egyptian way of things were never truly gone. Of all the presences that filled a woman's spiritual world, the tenderest was this, the presence of those she had loved and lost. For in the Egyptian way of understanding things, the dead were not simply gone. They had passed into another state of being, but they remained near, reachable, still bound to the living by ties of love and duty and memory. This belief shaped the way people grieved, and it softened grief in a way worth sitting with gently. The dead needed to be remembered and cared for, and fed not with the food of the living exactly, but through offerings made in their name. And so a person might bring bread, or drink, or a few simple gifts to the resting place of a loved one, or make such offerings at home, keeping the departed present in the ongoing life of the household. To speak the name of the dead aloud was itself an act of care, for a name remembered was a person not truly lost. In this way the bond was not severed by death, but continued quietly across the boundary between one world and the next. There was even a practice, striking and moving, of writing to the dead. People would set down messages to a departed husband, a mother, a relative, sometimes asking for help, sometimes for peace, sometimes simply keeping open a conversation that death had interrupted but not ended. These letters remind us how real and how near the dead felt, near enough to be addressed, near enough, perhaps, to answer. For a woman living alone, we can sense how much comfort might rest in all of this. She may have come to her solitary doorway precisely because someone had died, a husband, a parent, the companions of an earlier life, and yet her faith told her they had not wholly left her. In the corner of her home, at the offering place, in the speaking of a name, she could feel them still present, still part of her quiet household. The chair might be empty, but the bond was not. In the world her beliefs made real to her, she was, in a sense, not entirely alone at all. We must hold this with the usual care. We cannot climb inside the heart of any one woman and measure her grief or her consolation, and sorrow is sorrow in every age. Belief eases loss, but it does not erase it. What we can say is that her world offered her a framework in which love outlasted death, in which the departed remained reachable and near. That is a gentle thing to have been given, and alongside these great presences, the household gods, the festival crowds, the beloved dead, there were smaller, humbler protections too. Little things she could hold in her own hand against the fears of the night. To those we turn now. Alongside the great presences of her faith, the gods in their temples, the beloved dead, there were smaller comforts too, humble enough to hold in the palm of a hand. These were the amulets and charms of everyday life, and they may be the most touching part of all her spiritual world, because they were so small and so personal and so close. An amulet was a little protective object, often worn on the body, strung on a cord at the neck or the wrist, or kept somewhere near. They were made in many forms, each carrying its own meaning. There was the Vedjat, the eye symbol, worn for health and wholeness and protection against harm. There were small figures of the protective household gods, the same kindly guardians who stood in the corner shrine, now carried on the person wherever she went. There were charms for health, for safe sleep, for luck, for warding off the illnesses and misfortunes that no one in that world could fully explain or prevent. Some were finely made of glazed stone or faience, glowing blue-green. Others were plain and simple, within the reach of the poorest. Think of what these tiny things offered. The ancient world was full of dangers that could not be seen, or controlled sickness that came without warning, the ordinary perils of a life close to hardship, the long uncertainty of the dark hours. Against all of that vastness, a person could hold one small object, worn warm against the skin, and feel a measure of safety. It was protection made portable, faith you could close your fingers around. The unseen threats were enormous. The little amulet was small enough to carry everywhere, and in that contrast lay its comfort. For a woman living alone, this was a comfort particularly her own. When night came and the lamp burned low and the house was quiet with no other voice in it, she had near at hand a small guardian she could touch, an amulet for safe sleep resting against her, a charm for health kept close. These were not grand acts of worship, but intimate ones, the reassurance of the vulnerable made tangible, the ancient equivalent of something held tight for comfort in the dark, something that says quietly, you're watched over, you're not without protection, you may rest. We should remember, as always, that we see the objects more clearly than the feelings, and that different people surely held such things with different depths of belief. But the objects survive in their thousands, worn and kept and treasured, and they speak plainly enough of a very human wish to feel safe, to be protected, to carry a little shelter with you always. Her faith, then, reached from the great temples down to the charm at her throat. But faith was only one of the things that surrounded her in her solitude. There were also people the living, near neighbours just beyond her walls, and it is to that closeness, and to the true shape of her aloneness, that we turn next. We have spoken often of a woman living alone, but it is time to look more closely at that word, alone, because the truth of it was far gentler and far warmer than the word might suggest. She lived alone, yes, but living alone did not necessarily mean living in isolation, and to understand why, we need only look at the walls of her house and the lane beyond them. Egyptian villages were close-knit places, in the most literal sense. Homes stood pressed together, wall against wall, along narrow shared lanes. The mudbrick was thick, but it was not soundless, and a house was never far from the life of the houses around it. To live alone in such a place was not to live in isolation. It was to live in the very midst of others, separated from them by no more than an arm's length of earthen wall. This closeness filled her days with small, constant human contact, so ordinary that it might have gone almost unnoticed, and yet so steady that it held her firmly within the web of village life. There were voices through the walls, the ordinary sounds of neighbours going about their own days. There were the shared spaces where paths crossed a courtyard, a well, the lane itself, where a person could not step out of doors without meeting someone known. There was the endless small commerce of neighbourly life, the borrowing of a tool, the lending of a measure of grain, the return of a bowl, the passing of news, the exchange of a greeting and a word about the weather or the river or the day's small doings. None of this required a household of her own. She did not need a husband or children in her home to be woven into the daily fabric of the village. The neighbours did that for her, simply by being nearby, noticing when her lamp was lit, by calling a greeting as she passed, by asking after her when she had not been seen, by being there, close at hand, when help was truly needed. In a community so tightly bound, no one lived entirely apart from everyone else, and a woman on her own was still, always, part of the whole. There is deep reassurance in this, and it corrects a picture we might otherwise carry. We tend to imagine the person who lives alone as cut off, solitary, unseen. But her aloneness was of a different kind. She closed her own door at night and answered to no one within her walls, and yet all around her, near enough to hear, lived the people among whom she belonged. Living alone and remaining closely connected to others were, for her, entirely compatible. And out of this close web of neighbours, some ties grew warmer and deeper than mere proximity. Some became friendship chosen, cherished, sustaining. And it is to those bonds that we turn next. Out of the close web of neighbours, some ties grew into something warmer and more particular than mere nearness. They grew into friendship, the bonds a person chooses rather than inherits, and which, for a woman living without a household of her own, could become the quiet emotional centre of a life. We tend to think of the ancient family as the whole of a person's world, and family surely mattered enormously. But alongside the ties of blood ran the ties of affection, the friendships that formed in the ordinary places where lives overlapped. And a woman's days offered many such places. There was the river bank in the early morning, where women gathered with their jars and where a shared walk could become a shared confidence. There was the loom and the long hours of spinning and weaving that could be done side by side, hands busy and voices free to wander. There was the market and the festival crowd and the well and the shared courtyard, all the places where women met again and again until meeting became knowing and knowing became care. These friendships did real work in a life. They offered the things that a solitary household could not supply on its own: someone to talk with at the end of a long day, someone to lend a hand when the work grew too heavy, someone to notice when something was wrong, someone to sit with in trouble and to laugh with in ease. Shared labour built such bonds, and so did shared food and shared worry, and the simple accumulation of years spent living near one another. A friend could be, in many practical and emotional ways, what a family member was to others: a steady presence, a source of support, a reason to feel held in the world. For the woman living alone, this mattered more than we might quickly grasp. She had no partner in her house to share the weight of feeling, no children to fill the rooms with noise and need. What she had instead, if she was fortunate, was a circle she had made herself, the women of the river and the loom and the lane, who had become, over time, her chosen people. Family absent and belonging chosen, the two could balance, and often did. We should be honest that friendship leaves fainter traces in the record than property or law, and we're reconstructing much of this from the shape of daily life rather than from any diary of the heart. Not every woman was equally blessed in her friendships, and some surely were lonelier than others. But the human need for connection is old as humanity itself, and the ordinary occasions for meeting were everywhere in her world. The ordinary occasions for friendship were certainly present, even if the individual bonds themselves have mostly disappeared from the record. And yet even the most connected life has its quiet hours, its stretches of true solitude when the neighbours sleep and the friends have gone home. To those hours, and to the particular texture of being genuinely alone, we turn now. Even the most connected life has its quiet hours. The neighbours settle behind their own walls, the friends return to their own homes, the work is finished, the door is closed, and there comes a stretch of time when a woman living alone is as simply and truly alone. It would be dishonest to pass over this, and unkind to pretend it away, so let us sit with it gently, the way we might sit with the quiet of our own evenings. Picture the hour after the day's tasks were done, the bread made and eaten, the water fetched, the cloth set aside, the offering laid before the little shrine. The lamp burning low in a room that held no other voice. Outside, the village growing still. Beyond it, the river moving on in the dark. In such an hour there was no one to speak to, no one to turn toward, only her own company and the soft sounds of the night. For some, and in some moods, such solitude surely carried a weight of loneliness. It would be false to deny it. The absence of another person can ache, and there is no age of history in which the human heart did not sometimes long for company that was not there. We should not paint her evenings as untroubled simply because we wish them to be. And yet solitude is not only emptiness. It has another face, quieter and often overlooked, and it is worth honouring too. The hour alone was also an hour of peace. There was no one to please, no one to answer to, no demand pulling at her attention. She could sit with her own thoughts, or with no thoughts at all. She could rest exactly as she wished. The stillness of the single-person home was hers entirely, a stillness that many people in busier, more crowded lives would have found almost unimaginable, and perhaps even envied. To be alone in that room was also to be free within it. There is a difference, after all, between loneliness and solitude, between the alone that feels like a lack and the alone that feels like a kind of rest. The same quiet room could hold both, on different nights, in different moods, as the same quiet rooms hold both for us now. And a woman who had lived long with her own company likely came to know its gentler side well, the calm of an evening entirely her own, the soft company of the lamp and the river and her own steady breath. We cannot measure exactly what she felt, of course. The inner weather of ordinary lives leaves little trace, and we reconstruct it with care and humility. But we can honour the fullness of it, the ache and the piece together, the true and complicated texture of being alone. That is how she may have felt within her own walls. But there is another question, softer and more social. How did the world outside those walls see her? How did her village regard a woman who lived alone? To that we turn now. We have sat with how she may have felt within her own walls, but her life is also lived in the eyes of others, and so a gentler question remains. How did her village see her? What did it make of a woman who lived alone outside the familiar shape of the married household? The honest answer is that there was no single way she was seen, any more than there is a single way such a person is seen in any community, in any age. The regard of others is rarely simple, and hers would have shifted with who was looking and when and why. Much of it depended on circumstance. A respected widow, older, established in her home, known across many years for her steadiness and her decency, might be seen with genuine regard, a woman of standing in her own right, whose solitude carried no shadow at all. Her age and her history spoke for her. A younger woman alone, or one whose situation was less settled, might be viewed differently, with a mixture of feelings harder to name. There could be respect, and there could be warmth, and there could also at times be pity or curiosity, or the faint unease that any community can feel toward a life that does not fit its usual patterns. Class shaped this too, and reputation, and the simple luck of how a particular village in a particular time regarded such things. We must be especially careful here, more careful than anywhere, because this is exactly the kind of thing our evidence is poorest at telling us. The inner attitudes of ordinary people toward their neighbours rarely made it onto papyrus. What survives leans toward the well-off and the recorded, and it speaks far more readily of property and law than of the quiet social feelings that surrounded a solitary woman. Anyone who claims to know precisely how she was regarded is claiming more than the evidence allows. We are left to reason gently from the shape of human communities, which have always held a mixture of kindness and judgment toward those who live a little apart. And perhaps that mixture is the truest thing we can say. Real communities are not simple in their regard for anyone. They hold warmth and wariness together, respect and gossip, welcome and the raised eyebrow, often toward the very same person. A woman living alone was most likely seen in all these ways at once by different people and on different days, neither purely admired nor purely pitied, but held, as most of us are, in the complicated regard of those around her. She lived then, within this web of eyes and feelings, carrying herself through it with whatever dignity and care she could, and she carried herself through it not for a season but across the long arc of a life that, like all lives, moved slowly toward its later years. To that gentler chapter, the slow turning toward age, we now come. A life does not stay still. The woman we have followed through her mornings and her markets, her loom and her lamp, did not remain forever at the height of her strength. Like all of us, she grew older, and the shape of her days slowly changed with her. So let us follow her, gently, into her later years. The years told first on the body, the heavy work that had filled her mornings, the carrying of water, the long kneeling at the grinding stone, the hours at the loom, asked more of her than it once had. Her hands, so long practised and sure, grew slower. Her back and her knees remembered every jar she had ever carried. In a world without our medicines and comforts, age came harder and often sooner, and the ordinary tasks that a younger woman did without thinking became, in time, real labours that had to be measured out with care. And so her work shifted toward the gentler things. Perhaps she still spun thread, for spinning could be done seated, with hands that knew the motion by heart long after heavier work had grown too much. Perhaps she took on the quieter household tasks, and let the more demanding ones fall away. And more, she leaned upon the web of people around her, the neighbours, the friends, the younger hands who could carry what she no longer could. The community that had always been near now became in her age, something closer to support. The borrowing and lending that had run both ways through her middle years might tilt, gently, toward her receiving more than she gave. There was vulnerability in this, and we should not hide it. To grow old alone, without children of one's own in the house, was to depend on the kindness and the memory of others, and such kindness was never guaranteed. Age could be a hard season for anyone in that world, and harder still for one without a household to fall back on. And yet there was another side, quieter and worth honouring. An old woman who had lived long in one place carried something the young did not. A lifetime of knowledge, of memory, of skill and judgment gathered across many seasons. She remembered floods and famines the young had never seen. She knew the old ways of doing things, the remedies and the crafts and the customs. In a community bound by memory, a long life could confer a certain quiet standing, the respect owed to one who had endured, who had seen much, who had kept her own doorway through all of it. Frailty on one side and hard-won wisdom on the other, together in a single aging life. She had lived a long time now, and much lay behind her, and a life so lived leaves traces small marks upon the world that outlast the one who made them. To what she left behind, we turn now. A long life leaves traces, even a quiet one, and so it is worth asking, gently, what a woman such as this left behind her when at last her days came to their close, what remained in the world to say that she had lived. Some of what she left was simple and tangible. The belongings she had gathered across a lifetime, the bowl she had eaten from, the jars, the folded linen, the little amulet. Perhaps the loom itself did not vanish with her. They passed on into other hands. A favoured bowl became someone else's favoured bowl. A well-made length of cloth warmed another body. Egyptian legal traditions gave women meaningful control over property and inheritance, so at least some of what was hers could pass according to arrangements made during her lifetime, carrying a little of her forward into other hands. An object handed down is a kind of memory made solid, and for a time at least, the thing she had touched kept her present in the lives of those who received them. She left something less tangible too, and perhaps more lasting, the memory the village held of her. In a community bound so tightly by shared memory, a person was remembered for a while in the talk and the recollection of those who had known her. She was the woman who had lived in that house by the lane, who had woven such good linen, who had been kind or steady or generous, or simply present through so many seasons. Her name might be spoken for a time after she was gone, and to speak the name of the dead as her own faith had taught her was itself to keep a person from being wholly lost. And here we touch something quietly moving about all the ordinary lives that history so rarely pauses over. She left no monument, no inscription carved her deeds into stone, no royal record preserved her name for the ages. The grand story of Egypt, the kings, the temples, the great events, has almost nothing to say of her. By the measure of that grand story she vanished without a trace. And yet she did not truly vanish. She left the worn hollow in her doorstep pressed down by a lifetime of coming and going. She left the smooth curve of her grinding stone, shaped by her own daily labour. She left objects that outlived her, and a memory that lingered, and the simple fact of a life faithfully lived day after day in one small house beside the water. The great history is silent about her, but the small traces persist, quiet and real, and they are enough to tell us that she was here. Which raises a final, gentle question of its own. If the grand record passed her by, then how do we know of women like her at all? How can we sit, as we have, inside a life so humble and so long ago? To that we turn now. If the grand record of kings and temples passed her by, then a fair question arises, one we should pause over honestly before the night draws fully in. How do we know of women like her at all? How can we sit, as we have all this while, inside a life so humble and so distant in time? The answer is that ordinary lives, though they left no monuments, did leave traces, and patient hands have gathered them. Much of what we understand comes not from the great inscriptions, but from the small and the discarded and the everyday. From objects lifted out of the earth, the pottery, the tools, the grinding stones, the amulets, the plain belongings of plain homes. From the remains of houses themselves, whose mud-brick walls and worn floors still hold the shape of how people lived. And above all, from writing that was never meant for eternity, letters, lists, contracts, records of sales and disputes and debts set down on papyrus or on flakes of stone, and by good fortune preserved in Egypt's dry sands. There are places that have given us an unusual richness of this ordinary detail. A village of workers, its records survived in remarkable abundance, offering rare glimpses of how real people bought and sold and quarrelled and lived from day to day. It is from fragments like these, a note here, a contract there, an object somewhere else, that scholars have slowly, carefully pieced together the texture of ordinary life, including the lives of women who owned and earned and stood before the law and lived alone. But we must be honest about the limits, as we've tried to be all along, and perhaps most of all here. The evidence is incomplete and it is uneven. It survives best where the sands were dry and where someone thought a thing worth writing down, which means it leans toward those with property, with dealings worth recording, with a foothold above the very poorest. The lives that left no writing and few objects, often the humblest lives of all, are the hardest to see, and much about them we simply cannot know. When we speak of a woman living alone beside the Nile, we are reconstructing carefully from partial things. We're honouring the gaps, not filling them with invention. And so the woman we have followed tonight is, in truth, a gentle composite drawn from what the evidence allows, held together with care, offered not as one certain person but as a faithful picture of how such a life might really have been. That is the honest shape of this kind of history. Not certainty, but a patient, respectful reaching toward lives that were real, even where the record has gone quiet. We have reached then the edge of what we can know, and having honoured that, we can return one last time to her, to the small house, the fading light, and the close of a single ordinary day. So let us return to her one last time, and to the close of a single ordinary day. The light is going now, the same soft amber light in which we first found her, drawing back across the water and leaving the sky to deepen. Inside the small house the day's work is done. The water was fetched long ago in the cool of the morning. The bread was made and eaten, the cloth was set aside, the spindle at rest. The market lane is emptied, the neighbours have gone in behind their own walls, and the village has begun its slow settling into night. She moves through the last small acts of the evening without hurry, the way a body moves when it has done the same gentle things across 1,000 quiet nights. A little offering laid before the shrine in the corner, a flower perhaps, or a pinch of incense, its thin thread of fragrance rising in the still air, and a last word, in its way, with the household gods and with those she has loved and lost. The door drawn closed against the dark, the cool of the mud-brick walls gathering around her as the heat of the day releases its hold at last. And then the lamp. She settles near it, in the soft and shifting glow it throws across the earthen walls, and there is nothing left now that must be done. The whole long effort of the day, the carrying, the grinding, the weaving, the trading, the tending, all of it is behind her, finished and set down. What remains is only rest. The flame burns low, the oil sinks, the light grows smaller and softer, until it is little more than a warm ember in the dark, and the room folds gently into shadow. Beyond the walls the river runs on, steady and unhurried, and as it has run through every hour of this life and will run through every hour after. The stars have come out over the flat rooftops. The night is cool and vast and quiet, and yet the small room is safe within it. The door closed, the neighbours near, the walls holding what little warmth remains. There is a deep peace in a day fully lived and fully finished. All that striving in the light, and now this complete and gentle stillness. She lies down in the dark, her head at rest, her breathing slow and lets the day go. The lamp gutters, flickers, and quietly goes out, and in one small house among many, beside a river older than memory, a life settles softly into sleep. And perhaps, listening, you feel something of that same settling the day behind you, the quiet gathering close, nothing left to do but rest. So let us stay here a moment longer in the warm dark and let the night carry us gently the rest of the way. And so we come to the end of our slow walk beside the river. We began at dusk, with golden light lying across the water and a single lamp glowing in a small window. We wondered who lived there, and then, gently, we found out. We stepped across her worn threshold and into her cool rooms. We watched her fetch water in the morning, grind her grain, weave her cloth, and rest in the shade of the fierce midday. We walked with her through the market, and marvelled quietly at all she could earn and own and keep. We saw the law that gave her footing, the neighbours who held her close, the gods who kept her company, and the beloved dead who never truly left her. And we stayed with her, at the last, into her later years and the soft close of an ordinary day. There is nothing more now that needs to be understood tonight. No fact to remember, no thread to follow. The work of listening is done just as her work was done, and all that is left is rest. So let the river run on in the dark, somewhere far away and long ago. Let the small lamp burn low and lower and finally go out. Let the quiet gather around you the way it gathered around that small house beside the water, safe and warm and complete. Wherever you're listening from tonight, you're welcome here, and you're welcome to let all of it go now. The day is behind you. There is nothing you need to do. Let your breathing slow, let the warm dark hold you, sleep gently, rest well, and whenever you are ready to wander into another quiet corner of history, I will be here, and I will be glad, as always, that you came. Good night.